Well, welcome back. That last chapter about going across a desert. I think that's one of those great examples of a good author. Gives you a little bit of a feel of what that experience would have been like. Chapter 10. The Hermit of the Southern March. After they had ridden for several hours down the valley, it widened out, and they could see what was ahead of them. The river, which they had been following here, joined a broader river, wide and turbulent, which flowed from their left to their right towards the east. Beyond this new river grew a delightful country, rose in low hills, ridge beyond ridge, to the northern mountains themselves. To the right there were rocky pinnacles, one or two of them with snow clinging to the edges. To the left, pine-clad slopes, frowning cliffs, narrow gorges, and a blue streaks stretched away as far as the eye could reach. Shasta could no longer make out Mount Pyre. Straight ahead, the mountain range sank to the wooded saddle, which of course had to be the pass from Archenland into Narnia. "Woo-hoo-hoo, the north, the green north," neighed Bree. And certainly the lower hills looked greener and fresher than anything that Erebus and Shasta, with their southern-bred eyes, had ever imagined. Spirits rose as they clattered down to the waters meet of the two rivers. The eastern flowing river, which was pouring from the higher mountains on the west end of the range, was far too swift and broken with rapids for them to think of swimming it. But after some casting about, up and down the bank, they found a place shallow enough to wade. The roar and the clatter of the water, the great swirl against the horses' fetlocks, the cool, stirring air, and the darting dragonflies filled Shasta with a strange excitement. "Friends, we are in Archenland," said Bree proudly as he splashed and churned his way up the northern bank. "I think that river we've just crossed is called the Winding Arrow." "I hope we're in time," murmured Wynn. When they began going up slowly and zigzagging a good deal, for the hills were steep, it was all open park-like country with no roads or houses in sight. Scattered trees, never thick enough to be a forest, were everywhere. Shasta, who had lived all his life in an almost treeless grassland, had never seen so many or so many kinds. If you had been there, you would probably have known, he didn't, that he was seeing oaks, beeches, silver birches, rowans, and sweet chestnuts. Rabbits scurried away in every direction as they advanced, and presently they saw a whole herd of fallow deer making off among the trees. "Isn't this simply gorgeous?" said Erebus. At the first ridge, Shasta turned in the saddle and looked back. There was no sign of Tashbaan. The desert, unbroken except for the narrow green crack which they had traveled, spread to the horizon. "Hello," he said suddenly. "What's that?" "What's what?" said Bree, turning around. Wynn and Erebus did the same. "That," said Shasta, pointing. "It looks like smoke. Is it a fire?" "Sandstorm, I should say," said Bree. "Not much wind to raise it," said Erebus. "Oh," exclaimed Wynn, "look! There are things flashing in it. Look, they're helmets and armor, and it's moving this way." "By Tash," said Erebus, "it's the army. It's Rabadash." "Of course it is," said Wynn, "just as I was afraid of. Quick, we must get to Anvard before it." And without another word, she whisked round and began galloping north. Bree tossed his head and did the same. "Come on, Bree, come on," yelled Erebus over his shoulder. The race was very grueling for the horses. As they topped each ridge, they found another valley and another ridge beyond it. And though they knew they were going in more or less the right direction, no one knew how far it was to Anvard. From the top of the second ridge, Shasta looked back again. Instead of a dust cloud well out in the desert, he now saw a black, moving mass, rather like ants, on the far bank of the Winding Arrow. They were doubtless looking for a ford. "They're at the river!" he yelled wildly. "Quick, quick!" shouted Erebus. We might as well not have come at all if we don't reach Anvard in time. Gallop, Bree, gallop! Remember, you're a war horse!" It was all Shasta could do to prevent himself from shouting out similar instructions, but he thought, "Poor chap's already doing all he can," and he held his tongue. And certainly both horses were doing, if not all they could, all they thought they could do, which is not quite the same thing. Bree had caught up with Wynne, and they were thundering side by side over the turf. It didn't look as if Wynne could possibly keep up much longer. At that moment, everyone's feelings were completely altered by a sound from behind them. It was not a sound they had been expecting to hear. The noise and hooves and jingling armor mixed, perhaps with Kellerman battle cries. Yet Shasta knew it at once. It was the same snarling roar he had heard that moonlit night when they first met Erebus and Wynne. Bree knew, too. His eyes gleamed red and his ears lay flat back on his skull, and Bree now discovered that he had not really been going as fast, not quite as fast, as he could. Shasta felt a change at once. Now they were really going all out. In a few seconds, they were well ahead of Wynne. "It's not fair," thought Shasta. "I did think we'd be safe from lions here." He looked over his shoulder. Everything was only too clear. A huge, tawny creature, its body low to the ground, like a cat streaking across a lawn to a tree when a strange dog has got into the garden, was behind them, and it was nearer every second and half-second. He looked forward again and saw something that he did not take in or even think about. Their way was barred by a smooth green wall about 10 feet high. In the middle of that wall there was a gate, open. In the middle of the gateway stood a man, dressed, down to his bare feet, in a robe, colored like autumn leaves, leaning on a straight staff. His beard fell almost to his knees. Shasta saw all this in a glance and looked back again. The lion had almost got to Wynne now. It was making snaps at her hind legs, and there was no hope now in her foam-flecked, wide-eyed face. "Stop!" bellowed Shasta into Bree's ear. "Must go back! Must help!" Bree always said afterwards that he never heard or never understood this, and as he was in general a very truthful horse, we must accept his word. Shasta slipped his feet out of the stirrups, slid both his legs over the left side, hesitated for one hideous hundredth of a second, and jumped. It hurt horribly and nearly winded him, but before he knew how it hurt him, he was staggering back to help Erebus. He had never done anything like this in his life before, and hardly knew why he was doing it now. One of the most terrible noises in the world, a horse's scream, broke from Wynne's lips. Erebus was stooping low over Wynne's neck and seemed to be trying to draw her sword, and now all three, Erebus, Wynne, and the lion, were almost on top of Shasta. Before they reached him, the lion rose on its hind legs, larger than he would have believed a lion could be, and jabbed at Erebus with his right paw. Shasta could see all the terrible claws extended. Erebus screamed and reeled in the saddle. The lion was tearing her shoulders. Shasta, half mad with horror, managed to lurch toward the brute. He had no weapon, not even a stick or a stone. He shouted out idiotically at the lion as one would a dog, "Go home! Go home!" For a fraction of a second, he was staring right into the wide-open, raging mouth. Then, to his utter astonishment, the lion, still on its hind legs, checked itself suddenly, turned head over heels, picked itself up, and rushed away. Shasta did not for a moment suppose he had done any good. He turned and raced for the gate in the green wall, which now for the first time he remembered seeing. Wynne, stumbling and nearly fainting, was just entering the gate. Erebus still kept her seat, but her back was covered with blood. "Come in, my daughter, come in," said the robed and bearded man, and was saying then, "Come in, my son," as Shasta panted up to him. He heard the gate close behind him, and the bearded stranger was already helping Erebus off her horse. They were in a wide and perfectly circular enclosure protected by a high wall of green turf. A pool of perfectly still water, so full that the water was almost exactly level with the ground, lay before him. At one end of the pool, completely overshadowed with its branches, grew the hugest and most beautiful tree that Shasta had ever seen. Beyond the pool was a low house of stone roofed with deep and ancient thatch. There was a sound of bleating, and over on the far side of the enclosure there were some goats. The level ground was completely covered with the finest grass. Are you, panted Shasta, are you King Loon of Archenland? The old man shook his head. No, he replied in a quiet tone. I am the hermit of the southern march. And now, my son, waste no time on questions, but obey. This damsel is wounded. Your horses are spent. Rabadash is at this moment finding a ford over the winding arrow. If you run now, without a moment's rest, you will still be in time to warn King Loon. Shasta's heart fainted at these words, for he felt he had no strength left, and he writhed inside at what seemed the cruelty and unfairness of the demand. He had not yet learned that if you do one good deed, your reward is usually to be set to do another and harder and better one. But all he said out loud was, Where's the king? The hermit turned and pointed his staff. Look, he said, there's another gate, right opposite to the one you entered. Open it and go straight ahead. Always straight ahead. Over level or steep, over smooth or rough, over dry or wet. I know by my art that you will find King Loon straight ahead. But run. Run. Always run. Shasta nodded his head, ran to the northern gate, and disappeared beyond it. Then the hermit took Aravis, whom he had all this time been supporting with his left arm, and half led, half carried her into the house. After a long time, he came out again. Now, cousins, he said to the horses, it's your turn. Without waiting for an answer, and indeed they were too exhausted to speak, he took the bridles and saddles off both of them. Then he rubbed them both down so well that a groom in the king's stable could not have done it better. There, cousins, he said, dismiss it all from your minds and be comforted. Here is water, and here is grass. You shall have a hot mash when I have milked my other cousins, the goats. Sir, said Wen, finding her voice at last, will the Tarkina live? Has the lion killed her? I who know many present things by my art, replied the hermit with a smile, have yet little knowledge of things future. Therefore I do not know whether any man or woman or beast in the whole world will be alive when the sun sets tonight. But be of good hope. The damsel is as likely to live as long as any her age. When Aravis came to herself, she found that she was lying on her face on a low bed of extraordinary softness in a cool, bare room with walls of undressed stone. She couldn't understand why she had been laid on her face, but then she tried to turn and felt the hot, burning pains all over her back. She remembered and realized why. She couldn't understand why a delightfully springy stuff the bed was made of, because it was made of heather, which is the best kind of bedding, and heather was a thing that she had never even seen or heard of. The door opened, and the hermit entered, carrying a large wooden bowl in his hand. After carefully setting this down, he came to the bedside and asked, How do you find yourself, my daughter? My back is very sore, father, said Aravis, but there is nothing else wrong with me. He knelt beside her and laid his hand on her forehead and felt her pulse. There is no fever, he said. You will do well. Indeed, there's no reason why you should not be able to get up tomorrow. But now, drink this. He fetched the wooden bowl and held it to her lips. Aravis couldn't help making a face when she tasted it, for goat's milk is rather a shock when you're not used to it. But she was very thirsty and managed to drink it all and felt better when she had finished. Now, my daughter, you may sleep as you wish, said the hermit, for your wounds are washed and dressed, and though they smart, they are no more serious than if they had been the cuts of a whip. It must have been a very strange lion, for indeed, instead of catching you out of the saddle and getting his teeth into you, he has only drawn his claws across your back. 10 scratches, sore, but not deep or dangerous. I say, said Aravis, I have had luck. Daughter, said the hermit, I have lived 109 winters in this world, and have never yet met any such thing as luck. There's something about all this I do not understand, but if ever we need to know it, you may be sure that we shall. And what about Rabadash and his 200 horses? Asked Aravis. They will not pass this way, I think, said the hermit. They must have found a ford by now, well to the east of us. From there, they will try to ride straight to Anvard. Poor Shasta, said Aravis. Has he far to go? Will he get there first? There is good hope of it, said the old man. Aravis lay down again on her side this time, and said, Have I been asleep a long time? It seems to be getting dark. The hermit was looking out the only window, which faced north. This is not the darkness of night, he said presently. The clouds are falling down from Stormness Head. Our foul weather always comes from there in these parts. There will be a thick fog tonight. Next day, except for her sore back, Aravis felt so well that she had breakfast, which was porridge and cream, and the hermit said that she could get up, and of course she at once went out to speak to the horses. The weather had changed, and the whole of that green enclosure was filled, like a great green cup, with sunlight. It was a very peaceful place, lonely and quiet. Wyn at once trotted across to Aravis and gave her a horse kiss. But where's Bree? Said Aravis, when each had asked after the other's health and sleep. Over there, said Wyn, pointing with her nose to the other side of the circle. I wish you'd come and talk to him. There's something wrong. I can't get a word out of him. They strolled across and found Bree lying with his face toward the wall, and though he must have heard them coming, he never turned his head or spoke a word. Good morning, Bree, said Aravis. How are you this morning? Bree muttered something they could not hear. The hermit says that Shasta probably got to King Lune in time, continued Aravis, so it looks as if all our troubles are over. Narnia at last, Bree. I shall never see Narnia, said Bree in a low voice. Aren't you well, Bree, dear? Said Aravis. Bree turned round at last, his face mournful as only horses can be. I shall go back to Calormen, he said. What? Said Aravis. Back to slavery? Yes, said Bree. Slavery is all I'm fit for. How can I ever show my face among the free horses of Narnia? I who left a mare and a girl and a boy to be eaten by lions while I galloped all I could to save my own wretched skin. We all ran as hard as we could, said Wyn. Shasta didn't, snorted Bree. At least he ran in the right direction. Ran back. And that's what shames me most of all. I, who called myself a war horse and boasted of 100 fights, to be beaten by a little human boy, a child, a mere foal, who had never held a sword, nor had any good nurture or example in his life. I know, said Aravis. I felt just the same. Shasta was marvelous. I'm just as bad as you, Bree. I've been snubbing him and looking down on him ever since we met. And he turns out to be the best of us all. But I think it would be better to stay and say we're sorry than to go back to Calormen. That's all very well for you, said Bree. You haven't disgraced yourself, but I've lost everything. My good horse, said the hermit, who had approached them unnoticed because his bare feet made so little noise on that sweet dewy grass. My good horse, you've lost nothing but your own self-conceit. No, cousin, don't put your ears back and shake your mane at me. If you're really so humbled as you sounded a minute ago, you must learn to listen to sense. You're not quite the great horse you have come to think, from living among poor dumb horses. Of course you are braver and cleverer than them. You could hardly have helped being that. It doesn't follow that you'll be anyone special in Narnia. But as long as you know you're nobody special, you'll be a very decent horse, on the whole, and taking one thing with another. And now, if you and my other four-footed cousin will come round to the kitchen table, we'll see about the other half of that mash. Some valuable lessons there, huh? See you tomorrow night.